At 34, Vivienne Cole was the kind of woman who made boardrooms go quiet when she walked in, not because she was loud. Quite the opposite. She had this way of moving through a room like she already owned the outcome of every conversation in it. Measured, precise, her dark eyes cataloging everything before she'd even set down her coffee. As Chief Investment Officer of Meridian Capital in Toronto, she managed $11 billion in assets and answered to exactly one person, her grandfather, Roland Ashworth, who had built the firm from a two-room office on King Street West into one of the most respected private equity houses in the country. What happened to Vivienne on a Tuesday morning in March had nothing to do with markets, mergers, or quarterly projections. It started with a phone call from her grandfather's private line, a number she only ever saw when something was wrong. "Come to the house," he said. "Tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight." He'd sounded tired in a way she hadn't heard before. Roland Ashworth didn't do tired. He did deliberate. So she cleared her evening, told her assistant to push the Singapore call, and drove herself out to the Rosedale house, where she'd grown up eating Sunday dinners under a chandelier that had been in the family since 1958. He was already seated at the dining table when she arrived, a cup of tea going cold in front of him, a single manila folder sitting on the tablecloth beside his hand. "Sit down, Vivienne," she sat. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." "Can you do that?" She nodded. What Roland Ashworth told her over the next 40 minutes reordered everything she thought she understood about her family, about Meridian, and about herself. The short version, and there was no real short version, was this. 31 years ago, a man named Douglas Fenn had saved Roland's life. Not metaphorically. Literally pulled him from his car after a winter accident on the 400, stayed with him in the snow until the ambulance came, visited him twice in the hospital, and refused every attempt at repayment. Douglas Fenn, a pipefitter from Barrie, had said very simply that he didn't want anything, that he'd done what any decent person would do. Roland had never forgotten it. And when Douglas Fenn died of a heart attack 7 months ago, Roland had gone to the funeral, had met Douglas's son, had sat with him for an hour, and had come away with an idea so old-fashioned, so improbable, so thoroughly unlike anything Roland had ever proposed in his professional life that Vivienne initially assumed she'd misunderstood. "You want me to marry him," she said. "I want you to consider it. He's a plumber, Grandpa, a pipe fitter. There's a distinction, apparently. I don't care about the distinction." She set her hands flat on the table. "I'm a CIO of a major private equity firm. I manage pension funds. I have a board I answer to. You are asking me to enter a marriage of, what exactly? Obligation? Sentiment? Because you feel you owe a dead man something?" Roland looked at her steadily. "I'm asking you to meet him first. I've already said no. You said no before I finished the sentence, because the sentence didn't need finishing." She stood up. "I'm not doing this." She drove back to her condo on Adelaide and didn't sleep until 3 in the morning. By the following Friday, she had met Owen Fenn exactly twice. Once at her grandfather's house, where he'd shown up in clean jeans and a flannel shirt, carrying a small girl on his hip who looked about 4 years old and who regarded Vivienne with the grave, evaluating stare of someone much older, and once at a coffee shop on Queen West, where Owen had bought his own coffee before she arrived and shown no apparent interest in impressing her whatsoever. His daughter was named Pip. Short for Philippa, he'd explained, because his wife, his late wife, had loved old novels and thought the name was underused. Pip had bright dark eyes and a very serious opinion about which of the muffins at the coffee shop were worth eating and which ones were not. "Blueberries fine," Pip had informed Vivienne without being asked. "The lemon ones have too much sugar." Owen had given his daughter a look. "We talked about this." "I know," Pip said. "I'm sharing information." Vivienne had almost smiled. She hadn't let herself. Owen Fenn was 38. She knew from the background check she'd had run, because she was a professional, and professionals did not walk into situations blind. He'd inherited his father's business, a small pipe fitting and mechanical services company in Barrie. He owned a house he was apparently always in the process of fixing up. He'd been a widower for 2 years. His credit was unremarkable. His company turned a modest profit. He drove a truck that was 12 years old, and he'd never, as far as anyone could find, been involved in anything that would make Vivienne's compliance team nervous. He also hadn't asked her for anything, not once. He'd come to both meetings because Roland had called him, and he'd been direct about that. Your grandfather means a lot to my dad's memory, he'd said over his black coffee. I'll do what I can for him. But I'm not going to pretend this is a normal situation, and I'm not going to pretend I think it makes any sense. It doesn't make any sense, Vivienne agreed. No, he said. It doesn't. They'd sat with that for a moment. How old is she? Vivienne had asked, nodding at Pip, who was investigating a sugar packet. 4.5. She'll tell you 5 if you ask her. She seems very confident. She is. There was something in his voice when he said it. Not boasting. Just factual. Fond. The way you talk about someone you'd do anything for. Vivienne had taken the drive back across the 401 thinking about that tone of voice and trying very hard not to. She told Roland yes 3 days later. She told him it was a business arrangement, that she expected him to document it properly with the family lawyers, that she would not be moving out of Toronto, and that she had conditions. Of course you do, Roland had said, and he sounded relieved, in a way that made her feel, briefly, like she was 12 years old again and had done something unexpectedly right. The conditions were these. Owen and Pip would relocate to Toronto, to Vivienne's building. She arranged an apartment 2 floors below her own. Vivienne would maintain her schedule and her professional life unchanged. There would be no public announcement of any kind. The arrangement would be reviewed at 6 months. Owen had listened to the conditions and said, Pip needs to be at daycare by 8:15. If that doesn't work with your schedule, I need to know now. She hadn't been expecting that. I usually leave for the office at 7:30, she said. Okay. He'd nodded. Just so we're clear, I'm not asking you to take her. I'm asking you to know the constraint exists. Vivienne had looked at him for a moment. You manage your daughter's schedule and a full business from Barrie. Yes, by yourself, more or less. And you agreed to move to Toronto because my grandfather asked you to, because your grandfather asked, and because it seemed like the right thing. He met her eyes without apology. I don't have a better reason than that. If you need one, I understand. She hadn't needed a better one. She just needed to understand what she was dealing with. What she was dealing with, it turned out, was considerably more complicated than a pipefitter from Barrie. The first thing she noticed, and she noticed it the way she noticed anomalies in a financial model, that specific prickle at the back of her mind that said something here doesn't fit, was the phone calls. Owen stepped out to take them twice in the first 2 weeks of him living in the building. He was always quiet about it, always stepped away from Pip, always came back looking exactly the same as he'd left, which was in itself a kind of tell. People who got ordinary phone calls didn't consciously reset their expressions afterward. The second thing was the truck. He still drove the same 12-year-old truck, but twice she'd passed him in the building garage and seen him end a call that he clearly hadn't expected her to walk in on. And once she'd caught a word, just one, before he'd lowered his voice. Position. As in, financial position. As in, someone was updating him on something. She filed it away. She did not ask. What she did do, as October became November and November got cold the way Toronto gets cold, all at once, like a door being shut, was find herself eating dinner with Owen and Pip 3 times a week. Not because she'd planned to. It had started because Pip had knocked on Vivienne's door one evening while Owen was on a site call running late, a small person in dinosaur pajamas holding a box of macaroni and cheese and looking at Vivienne with an expression that very clearly said, I have the materials. Do you have the means? Vivienne could make macaroni and cheese. She had made it approximately 4 times in her adult life, and each time felt faintly absurd doing so, but she could do it. She'd made it, and Pip had sat at her kitchen island eating it very seriously, and had then looked around Vivienne's apartment with wide eyes and said, You don't have any stuff. I have stuff, Vivienne said. Where is it? Vivienne looked around. The apartment was immaculate and largely bare of anything personal. Good art on the walls, clean lines, Nothing that indicated a particular life being lived. I travel a lot, she said. I don't collect things. My dad collects things, Pip said. He has rocks. And he has a whole wall of books, and some of them are really boring, but he reads them anyway. What kinds of books? Pip considered this. Business ones, and the ones with maps in them. He likes the ones with maps. When Owen had arrived, slightly windswept and apologetic, and found his daughter cross-legged on Vivienne's kitchen floor, explaining the taxonomy of dinosaurs to a woman who managed $11 billion in assets. He'd stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression Vivienne couldn't quite categorize. Not embarrassment, something softer than that. I'm sorry, he said. She made macaroni, Pip said with the confidence of someone reporting an objective fact. I can see that. It was good, Pip added, looking at Vivienne. You should do it again sometime. After that, dinner happened. Not every night, but often enough that Vivienne stopped being surprised by the sound of small feet in the hallway, or by Owen appearing at her door with something from the Italian place on King because he'd made extra and it seemed wasteful not to. He never assumed, he always knocked, and he talked to her, not about feelings, not about the arrangement, not about what any of this meant, but about things. The work he was doing on a heritage building retrofit downtown. The book Pip had decided she needed read to her 17 times. The particular challenge of a mechanical system in a 1920s building that had been modified so many times nobody had a reliable schematic anymore. He was, she realized, genuinely interesting. She found this inconvenient. The man who changed everything, or rather, the man who made everything impossible to ignore, was named Garrett Thorne. She knew that name, Thorne Capital, a private equity firm out of Vancouver with aggressive acquisition targets and a recent very pointed interest in mid-market infrastructure companies. Her compliance team had flagged them twice in the past year, not for anything illegal, just for patterns. The pattern of a firm that moved in on family-owned companies under financial pressure and restructured them in ways that technically improved balance sheets and substantially eliminated anything that had made them good places to work. In mid-November, Vivienne received a quiet inquiry from a contact at BDC, the Business Development Bank. Someone was making preliminary moves on a small to mid mechanical services company based in Barrie. Someone was doing so through a numbered holding company. Someone with Thorne Capital adjacent financing. She'd almost set it aside, and then she'd looked at the name of the company. Fen Mechanical Services. She sat at her desk for a long time after that. She didn't tell Owen. She did her own digging first, because that was how she operated. Not out of distrust, but out of a deeply ingrained conviction that you did not walk into any room without knowing more than the person across the table. What she found took her 4 days and left her sitting on her kitchen floor at midnight with her laptop and a glass of wine she wasn't drinking. Owen Fenn didn't just own Fenn Mechanical Services. He was the holding company. Or rather, and this was where the structure got interesting, layered in the way that sophisticated planning always was. Owen Fenn was the silent principal behind a trust structure that owned controlling interests in 8 mechanical and infrastructure services companies across Ontario and Alberta, with combined revenues that had nothing whatsoever to do with Modest, the truck, the flannel shirt, the house he was always fixing up, all of it accurate, all of it also deeply, deliberately incomplete. He wasn't hiding wealth in the way of someone ashamed of it. He was protecting it. From what? She wasn't sure yet. But the structure was defensive, the kind of defensive that came from experience. She waited. 3 days later, Owen knocked on her door at 7 in the evening. Pip was at a sleepover with the daughter of a colleague of his, apparently a child named May, who had very strong feelings about craft supplies. Owen was alone. He was wearing the same kind of thing he always wore, dark jeans, a heavy knit sweater, and he had the look of someone who had decided to say something and was going to say it before he changed his mind. "Can I come in?" She stepped back. He sat at her kitchen island, the same spot Pip always chose, and put both hands flat on the counter. "There's something I should tell you," he said, "and I should have told you sooner. I'm not sure why I didn't, except I didn't know what we were, and it seemed easier to wait, and that was the wrong call." She said nothing. She leaned against the counter across from him and waited. Thorn Capital is trying to acquire some of my holdings, he said, through a shell. They think they're being quiet about it. They're not quiet enough. He looked at her. You're going to find out anyway, if you haven't already, and I didn't want you to find out through a filing. I found out 4 days ago, she said. He absorbed that without moving. How much do you know? Enough. She held his gaze. Why didn't you say anything? From the beginning. You sat across from my grandfather, you sat across from me, and you let me run background on you and find a pipe fitting company in Barrie. Your grandfather knew, Owen said. He's known for 3 years. She hadn't known that. She let it settle. He didn't tell you, Owen continued, because he said you needed to make your own decision. He said if he told you, you'd make a business decision. He wanted you to make a different kind. The kitchen was very quiet. That's extraordinarily manipulative, Vivienne said. Yes, Owen agreed. He's good at it. Despite herself, despite everything, she almost laughed. Didn't quite, but almost. Why the truck, she said. Why all of it? Owen was quiet for a moment. My wife, Nadia, she got sick about 2 years before she died. During that time, I learned a lot about which people in my life were there because they valued me, and which ones were there because of what I represented. He said it, simply, without self-pity, the way you talked about something you'd processed to the point where the shape of it no longer surprised you. After she died, I restructured everything, took myself out of the front of it, hired good people to run the businesses and stepped back. It wasn't about hiding. It was about figuring out what actually mattered. Vivienne looked at him. And Pip is the whole point, he said. She thought about the books with maps, the rocks, the macaroni and cheese. She thought about the particular way he had of watching Pip across a room, not hovering, not anxious, just present, attending to her without crowding her. Thorn is going to keep pushing, she said, because she was herself again, and herself dealt in what was real and what was next. I know, he nodded. I've been trying to handle it quietly. It's getting less quiet. You need someone who understands the financing structure they're using. He looked at her. I'm not offering because of Roland, she said. I'm offering because it's an interesting problem and I'm very good at what I do. I know you are, he said, and the way he said it, direct without flattery, the same way he talked about everything, hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. She pulled out her laptop. Tell me what you know about the Shell Company. What followed was 3 weeks of the most focused professional work Vivienne had done in years, which was saying something, because she did not have an unfocused professional mode. Together, they mapped the acquisition structure Thorn was using, identified the pressure points, and built a counter position that was elegant in the specific way that good financial architecture was elegant. It didn't just stop Thorn, it made another move inadvisable. Owen understood the mechanics of his businesses with a depth that made her work faster, because she didn't have to translate. She spoke the language, and so did he. A different dialect, but close enough. Pip, during this period, took to coming upstairs after dinner and doing her drawings at Vivienne's kitchen island while the adults worked. She had decided, with the absolute authority of someone who had evaluated the situation and reached a conclusion, that Vivienne's apartment was a good place to draw because the light was better. Vivienne had bought her a specific kind of colored pencil she'd mentioned only once in passing. Pip had found them on the counter the next morning, said, "Oh good," and gone back to her drawing, and Vivienne had felt something happen in her chest that she'd chosen not to examine too closely. The confrontation with Thorn happened in December, in a boardroom in a glass tower on Bay Street, and it was not a comfortable meeting for anyone in it except, possibly, Vivienne. She had spent 22 years learning how to sit across from people who thought they held more cards than she did, and she had a particular way of waiting while someone finished explaining their position that had unnerved more experienced people than Garrett Thorne's representatives. She laid out the counter position without theater. Just, here is what you think you're doing. Here is what will actually happen if you proceed. Here is what you will lose if you push further. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Owen sat beside her and said very little. He didn't need to say anything. His presence in the room, his calm, his absolute unintimidated attention, it changed the geometry of the conversation in ways she understood instinctively. Thorne withdrew the inquiry before Christmas. On December 23rd, Roland Ashworth had what his doctor called a cardiac episode. Not a heart attack. He was at pains to clarify when Vivienne arrived at the hospital in less time than she'd strictly been obeying traffic laws, but a serious warning. Serious enough to land him in hospital for 4 days. Serious enough to age him in those 4 days in a way she hadn't seen coming and couldn't fully absorb. Owen drove her to the hospital. She hadn't asked him to. She'd been in the lobby of their building pulling on her coat when he came through the elevator already wearing his jacket and holding his keys. "I'll drive," he said. She didn't argue. She sat in the passenger seat of the 12-year-old truck while Toronto moved past the windows, gray and cold, and she did not say anything and Owen did not try to make her, and that specific quality of being with someone who understood that silence was sometimes the only honest thing was what undid her. Quietly, without drama. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and looked out the window and let it. He didn't say anything, he just reached across and put his hand briefly over hers. She kept it together. She was good at that. Roland recovered. Slowly, stubbornly, in the way of someone who found being ill personally offensive. He was home before the new year, arguing with the home care nurse about his diet before he'd been back 24 hours. January arrived. The 6-month review she'd stipulated, the formal, lawyerly review she'd been so careful to build in, came and went without either of them mentioning it. She noticed. She suspected Owen noticed. Neither of them raised it. What Vivienne did instead was take a Saturday, a full Saturday, not a morning before calls, not a gap between commitments, and go with Owen and Pip to the Science Center. Because Pip had been asking about the space exhibit for 3 weeks, and Owen had promised, and his site meeting had moved and he'd mentioned it in passing, and Vivienne had heard herself say she'd like to come, if that was all right. It was all right. She stood in the planetarium with Pip's small hand in hers. Pip had taken it matter-of-factly. The way she approached everything she'd decided was reasonable, and looked up at the projected stars and felt, for the first time in a long time, like she was somewhere she hadn't planned to be and didn't need to plan her way out of. Owen stood beside her in the dark. Their shoulders were touching. "She's going to want to be an astronaut after this," he said quietly. "Just so you know. We're going to be managing that for months." "It's a reasonable ambition," Vivienne said. "It's an expensive one. Most of the best ones are." He looked at her. In the planetarium light, his face was all shadow and something else. Something she'd stopped pretending not to see. "Vivienne," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not interested in being a business arrangement." She looked back up at the stars. Her heart was doing something she typically didn't permit. "I know that too," she said. "So what are we doing?" She took a breath. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. Pip had pressed forward toward the front, craning up at a particular constellation with the focus of someone filing it away. "I think," Vivienne said carefully, "that we're doing something I didn't plan for, and that I'm not particularly good at, and that I'm going to do anyway." She paused. "Which is not a sentence I say often." "I know," he said, and he was smiling. She could hear it. On a Tuesday morning in March. Exactly 1 year to the week since Roland had called and told her to come to the house. Vivienne stood at the head of Meridian Capital's quarterly strategy meeting and walked 27 people through a portfolio analysis with the efficiency she'd been known for since she was 29 years old. The numbers were strong. The room was attentive. She was exactly as precise and unreadable as she had always been. Afterward, her assistant Priya, who had been with her for 6 years and knew more about how she actually operated than almost anyone, fell into step beside her in the hallway and said very quietly, "You look different. I'm wearing the same suit." "That's not what I mean." Vivienne looked at her. "Good different," Priya said, and peeled off toward her desk with the diplomacy of someone who knew exactly where the line was. Owen was in the lobby when she came down at 5:30. He was in his work clothes, which meant there was a mark of something on his left wrist he hadn't fully gotten off. Pip was at after-school care until 6. He'd come downtown for a site meeting 2 blocks over and had apparently calculated the timing to the minute. He handed her a coffee from the place on Wellington she actually liked, not the closer one she tolerated. "How was the meeting?" he asked. "Efficient," she said. "High praise. From me, yes." They walked out into the March air, which was still cold but had that particular quality Toronto air got in late winter. Not warmth exactly, but the suggestion of it. The memory of what warmth was, returning. She didn't take his arm. She walked beside him, close enough that their hands brushed with every other step, and neither of them moved away, and that was, for now, exactly what it needed to be. Roland Ashworth, when they visited that Sunday, looked at the two of them across the dining table with the expression of a man who had played a very long game and was privately satisfied with how it had gone. He didn't say so. He was too good for that. He did, however, refill everyone's tea without being asked and tell a story about Douglas Fenn that Vivienne had never heard, about the night of the accident, the cold, the way this stranger had sat with him in the dark and talked, just talked, about nothing in particular, just to keep him present and calm until the lights came. Owen listened to the story the way you listened to something you'd heard before and still wanted to hear again. Pip, who had been given a piece of Roland's shortbread and deemed it acceptable, looked up from her drawing and said, "Was it scary?" "It was," Roland said, "and then it wasn't, because someone stayed." Pip nodded slowly, as if this made complete sense. Vivienne thought it made complete sense too.